This episode of Vintage Guitar Magazine's Buy That Guitar podcast is brought to you by Willie's American Guitars. For 35 years, Willie's has been an international destination for vintage and quality used equipment. We are total nerds. We buy, sell, trade, do all levels of repairs, and just plain admire that American institution, the guitar. Willie's American Guitars in St. Paul. We love old guitars. Google us.
Hello, and welcome to Buy That Guitar, presented by Vintage Guitar Magazine. I'm your host, Ram Tuli. This podcast is about the joy of guitars. Buying guitars, selling guitars, collecting guitars, vintage guitars, new guitars, old guitars, custom shop guitars, amplifiers, basses, cellos, banjos, you name it. If it's got strings, it can be amplified. This is what this podcast is about. I've spent most of my life analyzing the vintage guitar market. It's truly something I love, and it's truly something I'm passionate about. I can talk about guitars all day, and I'm going to. We're going to spend about 45 minutes with my first guest, Nate Westgor, owner and proprietor of Willie's American Guitars. Today, this is a kind of a kickoff. We're just going to discuss why today's market is basically dominated by two brands, and that's Fender and Gibson.
Ram, I got to tell you, when I do stuff like this, I set out guitars, and just so I have something for my eye, because I'm so ADHD that I just set up a couple of guitars that I can stare at because they comfort me.
Yes.
You know, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I have a 63 SG standard. It's cool, and that is such a sexy design. You just, especially with all the sexy curves and angles on it, and then a 58 two-tone Strat. So those are sitting next to me, and if I drift, it's because I'm staring at those.
Okay. Today I'm speaking with my good friend, Nate Westgor. Nate, you and I have been friends for a long, long time. Even before I was doing the co-author of the Vintage Guide, you and I would always talk guitars.
Yeah.
This podcast is about all things guitars. We're talking guitars, selling guitars, collecting guitars, buying guitars. Most of the readers of Vintage Guitar Magazine, they're geared toward that golden era. A lot of guys aren't. They're geared toward the custom shop stuff or the new stuff. It all comes down to just a love of playing guitar. And this is what this podcast is really going to be about. And for the inaugural podcast, I really wanted you on because you and I always talk about what the market looks like and why it looks like that. And, we both track the market very carefully. We both track collectible markets. And I figured this would be a perfect way. And for this very first podcast, what I'd really like to do is just talk with you and figure out why the market looks like it does. Like, why is it that when Grandpa went to the music store in 1960, you better hope that he picked a Gibson or a Fender off the wall.
Yeah.
And they put it in his closet for you to find, 60 years later, I think we'll go way back to the beginning. Let's go back to the beginning of this previous century, and we're going to wind up why Gibson and why Fender matter so much in this market,
Yeah.
And
history tends to repeat itself. That's the one thing. As we look at the market, we all look at the past. You don't know where anything's going until you know where it's been. And so people come up all the time, and what do you think this new guitar is going to do? There's a thing of modern collectibles, stuff. That's true of watches and cars. There's limited editions. There's vintage reissues. But you really can't tell until they've had a past where they're going to go or a likely going to go. And what you said is right. You really have to imagine a time. There's no iPhone. There's no internet. It sounds all kind of boring, but the news traveled very slow, and fashions traveled very slow, and in guitars, music traveled very slow. And when I start talking about vintage guitars, I always like to start at the last pandemic, because as a group, we all went through this terrible pandemic. And the last pandemic, the Spanish flu, happened right around World War I, which was
1914, 15.
Yeah, the World War I era. And when people came back from that, was the Roaring Twenties came right after that. And the Roaring Twenties was jazz music. We, as Americans, invented jazz music. And it was where people dived into speakeasies and let off some steam. And as audiences got bigger, instruments got bigger. There is, as you said before, there is the mandolin era, the banjo era, and the 20s was kind of Dixieland jazz, so to speak. And guitars were a thing, but Gibson banjos and Gibson mandolins in the 20s, you think of a Lloyd Loar, that was a huge advancement in trying to get a louder instrument because your audiences were growing. Same with banjos. The most coveted mandolins and the most coveted banjos are made by Gibson.
Right.
And it all kind of relates to that era. And even the resonator guitars were there to broadcast to a larger audience without the advancement of electricity.
Right. And that's the thing about a guitar player. If you were a guitar player and you were born in the turn of the century, you really were a nobody. You know, you really, right. You were basically, you might have been okay in the parlor, and your buddies are playing the lute and the mandolin, but you're just the rhythm guy. You're the guy that's just setting up the rhythm. And so it's a jazz age. You get asked to be in a larger ensemble. Well, you're sitting on the side of the bandstand. There's nothing you can do that's going to cut through the clattering and chattering and the everybody paid to see the clarinet guy, who could push the his instrument through the fog of the noise.
Right.
And a guitar meant nothing. So, we ask guitar player, makers, can you make a louder guitar? Well, all they can do is make a bigger guitar, a wider guitar, a fatter guitar. Does nothing to give you more volume. You're still locked in that fog of noise. And it's really, the resonator kind of gives you an ability to kind of compete with the banjo a little. Yeah, it's a mechanical
speaker. It's not driven by electricity. It's a mechanical speaker, all to amplify the guitar. Even Martin at the time, they put on steel strings to amplify the guitar. They started making larger sizes. In the late 20s, they made the first dreadnought, which was obscenely large. And guys were starting to use heavier and heavier strings as we move into the 30s. By the early 40s, they had to rebrace the guitars to accommodate, in fact, these heavier strings.
Martin collectors basically think that is where everything changes, when they rebrace the guitar. When you go from the scallop bracing, which was, pre-war guys want that scallop bracing, and I guess, Gibson too, they come with their big super jumbos and the 400, they come with these 18-inch, I think Stromberg made a 19-inch guitar. But you get to where you actually can compete a little bit with volume, but you're still not anybody on that bandstand. The first lead guitar guy was a lap steel guitar. That was the first thing. The first solid body was a lap steel. And Hawaiian music, we talked about Hawaiian music was huge in 1918. It was also huge after World War II.
Yeah, the number one selling records were Hawaiian slack key music in 1919.
Yep.
That was really a big thing. And that brought along a lot of Hawaiian music, Hawaiian ukuleles, square neck guitars. A lot of those are 20s and 30s.
Yep. And then you get to Leo Fender. He basically takes the lap steel that he's making and he turns it sideways, and it becomes the first solid body, the first commercially available solid body guitar is just basically a lap steel that he turns sideways. It has everything. It's got the same pickup. It's got the same sort of bridge, but it's got intonation. And so here we go, 1950. That's kind of where we kick it off, where all of a sudden you got New York, Chicago, Kalamazoo making arch tops that can be electrified. And then you got a solid body guy in Fullerton, California, who's a nobody. Known mostly for making amps that can be turned a little bit louder. But, as we know, and that's kind of like where we get to 1950, and then we get to the solid body guitar, and that changes everything. First, all of Leo Fender's competitors laughed at him. That first NAMM show in 1950, they laughed at him. They called the canoe. He's got the canoe paddle. He's got the.
Oh, it was even in the trade magazines, as music magazines were writing about it, they did laugh at it. They really thought this was a passing fad. That's why early solid bodies from Gibson had no serial number. They thought it was a passing fad. And then you mentioned 1936. That's when the advancements to the archtop. Epiphone was the king. In the 30s and 40s, Epiphone was the king. And Gibson bought them later to, that's too long a story for today. We'll cover it, but you get into World War I or World War II in the 40s, and everything kind of stopped. But Gibson was secretly making a lot of flat top guitars, and they were late to the game for flat top guitars.
Right.
But they were early to the game for electric guitars.
Mm-hmm. People always think that Les Paul came up with that gold top idea. By the time they gave it to Les Paul, they had already got the two woods they figured out they would work together. Mm-hmm. The only thing they got from Les Paul was the bridge. which they imposed poorly originally.
Yes.
It was already gold by the time Les Paul saw it.
Yes.
It already had the maple cap, shaved cap on. They were kind of holding back. It was only when Fender sells thousands, they're like, wow, Gretsch and Gibson jump right on that train. And, they make, God, what do they make? Like 2,000 Les Pauls?
Yeah, if you look back at Fender's early catalog shots and the shots that surface in some of the great books that are out there, and they're showing especially amplifiers. When I was a young man, I met a guy that owned Ryman Music. He was 98 years old in the late 80s, early 90s, and he said to me that we would have Fender amps. You couldn't get them. But we'd hide them behind the counter, and we'd try to sell them anything else until he insisted that he heard we were a Fender dealer, and then we'd regretfully put it out on the counter, and the Fender sounded so much better than anybody else's, and it sold right away, and then we'd call the factory and order another one. But old man Ryman at 98 would talk about these early days, late 40s, early 50s. The amplifier put him on the map. Right. And it was known to be indestructible and sounded fantastic.
It fell off the bus, and they put it back on the bus, and it worked. That's
Fender's history. Yep. That's what made them badasses. Right. Is the fact that they made super durable stuff, easy to fix. That was Leo's intention. It didn't take off very well. And to think too of music of the day. Elvis wasn't there. I just sold a 52 Les Paul and a 52 Tele. Chuck Berry wasn't even in a band. Elvis hadn't recorded one thing yet. It was really early days. I mean, there was R&B players, B.B. King, guys like that playing these gold tops, but it was really a hard time, I think, especially for young people to imagine the influences of the day and these solid bodies. And you ask, why did they refinish it? Why did they do this? Because the influences, the heavy influences really didn't happen. Right. I mean, Elvis was the guy. Late 55, early 56, that broke all the molds. And that's what really
we were talking about earlier, before Elvis, when you bought an amplifier, it had instrument input. Right. It didn't say guitar input. It said instrument input 1, instrument input 2. Because in those days, most things being amplified were accordions or, lap steels or whatever. But that was really, and you think about, how if you look on your wall and you got a Les Paul and then you got a nice big ES 350. Yeah. Look how tiny that gold top looks next to the big guitar, Totally. And that was a kind of a thing, like, that people didn't really want to be seen with that little guitar. It was just kind of a hard, it looked like the 3/4 scale thing that they were selling, the ES 140. Right. In fact, that was the same body dimension, I believe. So it was you were, like you were saying, it was a tough, when you think of early rock and roll, you don't really, you just don't, nobody's playing that gold top. Nobody's playing a Telecaster. Nobody's playing a Stratocaster yet. And that's going to last almost through the 50s, because you think of the Gretsch was kind of the rock and roll credibility guitar, right? When you think of all the great solos that were recorded, they were on hollow body arch tops.
Yeah, and the cats, the guys that played with all those pop stars. It's Perry Como, it's Frank Sinatra, it's big bands with a singer in front. That was what came after the war, and the big ass guitars were the ones, the D'Angelicos, the Super 400s, the L5s. That was the guitar of the star. There were guys playing the electric solid bodies, but you're right. It was like, what is that? You kind of got laughed at.
Right. When you think about the rockabilly era, like in the 80s, it had to be a big guitar because that was what it was. You're sure fine looking, that whole thing. And so it's almost like an amazing thing when we think about why today is that Les Paul, Stratocaster, Telecaster, and SG the ones that matter? Because they weren't really desired. Even the 50s, we know what happened. Yeah. We know what happens up Elvis. When Elvis comes, everybody wants to play guitar, but they're going to play the big, you think about the greatest solos were ES 295 were played on it. Right. So like for me, like that was my dream guitar, right? To get that big gold ES 295 and play that hound dog solo on it, Right. And that's kind of thing. So now let's figure out now, why is it that today it's really only that solid body Fender and that solid body Gibson that people are going to pay more than $20,000 for if it was made before 1965. You know what I mean? No other brand is going to even come close to that right now anymore.
I think if we look at the early days of Fender, the amplification really, they had it down. They made a deluxe in 1946. They still make a deluxe today. And it was all about reliability. I used to play with Bobby V's kids, and Bobby V had a bunch of top 10 hits. He had the Rolling Stones back him up. His sax player left Bobby V and joined the Stones. He was a dude, and his break came after Buddy Holly died in 59. So that late 50s, Elvis goes into the Army, Buddy Holly dies, and along with the Big Bopper, and it really was, the day the music died.
Yeah.
But here's something that Bobby V told me. All the gear went forward in a van, and Bobby V, who lived in Minnesota, the next stop that he was supposed to make, that Buddy Holly was supposed to make, was in Fargo. What arrived was his guitar and 6 basements, and they used the basement for a PA system. They used it for a bass, for guitars. Those basement amplifiers were legendarily rock solid and loud enough to deal with these growing larger crowds.
Right.
And that durability, that viability really made it for Fender. That's where they made their name. There is it might get loud. There's a book that talks about Leo Fender sitting at the edge of stages and listening to what musicians want and going home and tinkering, and reliability was a big thing. Tone was a big thing. Lack of distortion was a big thing. And likewise with the guitars came that too. And even today, Fender's durability makes it a durable collectible. I mean, guys will collect Fenders over Gibsons just because of that. You can use your Telecaster in a bar fight if you have to.
And the people did.
It'll still work the next day.
Yeah. Like all those movies where the guy in the Palomino comes running up and the guy takes his Telecaster and Kazam or whatever that was.
Right.
El Caban. That's what it is.
Right.
So.
Right. Even B.B. King would talk about, Lucille was a big fight over that, and he grabbed his guitar and pushed his way through the crowd. And it is I think it's the durability, that the reliability that musicians idolize. And back in the day, there was fan magazines for Elvis and that, but we didn't quite get until we get into the 60s, until the Beatles hit, this adulation and what do they play, and I want to play guitar too, and oh my God, the girls are screaming, I can't take it. And to put a side note on it, but Frank Sinatra started that. His manager hired women to scream in theaters across the country, and it turned it to be a contagion. And later on, it just gave permission for people in rock groups to scream as well. It was just a thing that happened, and that influences a million young guitar players.
Right. The important thing, when I think of Gibson and Fender, they're polar opposites of each other.
Yes.
Gibson is a massive conglomerate. They manufacture the best guitars in the world. They have a reputation, a heritage, second to none, and they're Dutch artisans that craft these instruments to exacting standards. Fender is basically founded by a radio repairman who doesn't even play guitar, and he basically hires seasonal workers who cut, shave, and screw wooden planks together.
Right.
And yet both these guitars are polar opposites of each other, and yet they're so valued right now. I play everything, and when it comes down to it, you settle back on that Telecaster and Stratocaster because it's just so you don't have to retune it. It has no temperature variances. It's there, you tune it once before you get on the stage, and it's there forever. You don't really have to even retune it once. If you got the 335 or you got the Les Paul, well, guess what? You're retuning it every song. And there's just a lot of differences, but there's tonal differences too, that matter. So just
and Gibson sold fine art.
Right.
That's what they kept. That was they were like, we were making cellos. Basically, we had history that goes back hundreds of years because we're basically making mandolins, which are tuned like violins. We're making cello acoustic guitars, which is basically what those old guitars are. And they advertise their fine art, their choicer woods, their hand-done finishes. That was their angle. And they had a lot of guys that were coming out of the big band era that were still superstars, Les Paul being one. And it's amazing how many hits Les Paul had by 52.
Right.
He came out. They They were like, "Oh my God, can we get Les Paul's name on it?" He was a giant.
I mean, he had more number ones than just about anybody, and it's kind of sad to think in 1961, Gibson just shoves him out the door to bring in the jazz greats. They get rid of the Les Paul model and they bring in all these other models just to, because that was the market they saw coming.
There's a story a couple of guys have told me that Les Paul was also going through a divorce at that time.
Yes.
And that he didn't like the shape of the guitar, but they certainly had to come crawling back in the late 60s and make nice with Lester. Right.
And you think about all the ones that they replaced the Les Paul with, all the new signature models. The Trini Lopez, I guess, is somewhat successful, for collectors. Talfaro and the other ones, they don't really, it's hard to sell these arch tops now. That's for sure.
Yeah, later on we're going to get into some of the fashion trends that happen, but I can remember, I've been a dealer for 45 years, and you couldn't give Trini Lopez's away. It's also the Flying V. There's a famous story of Gibson salesman going to Frank Sinatra's guitar player, and they offered to give him a Flying V, an original one. And had they told him it's going to be worth $500,000-$600,000 in the future, he might have taken it. But you couldn't give those away. That's why they made so few. They just hung on walls as a gag. It was way over the top modernistic. So Gibson tried as best they could, but they had really dug themselves a hole in this very stoic, traditionalism, and they really did think that rock was kind of a passing fad. They hung their hat on that. Fender kind of hung their hat on the Southern California country guys.
Right.
And
nobody was really nobody liked, Leo Fender hated rock and roll.
Right.
You get Johnny Smith and Carlo coming in, and these guys with Trini Lopez and all these guys making their signature. Barney Kessel coming in, and because that was TV guitar. That's where you saw the TV people. Rock and roll is really not going to be a factor until bang, we know what happens, right?
Yeah. I think really, the Elvis thing came and went, and then actually after Elvis went into the Army, eyes came off him. He was still in the papers a lot, but he got back into movies after that. And then Buddy Holly's death too. After that, it's a weird time period. Pop music, Perry Como. There was guys that came back that was really pop music.
We call it the Vinton-esque era. Before Vinton,
totally.
Bobby Vinton, all the doo-wop stuff comes back, and then bang! All of a sudden, there's the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, 1964.
This episode of Vintage Guitar Magazine's Buy That Guitar podcast is brought to you by Willie's American Guitars. For 35 years, Willie's has been an international destination for vintage and quality used equipment. We are total nerds. We buy, sell, trade, do all levels of repairs, and just plain admire that American institution, the guitar. Willie's American Guitars in St. Paul. We love old guitars. Google us.
I'm gonna tell one more Bobby V story, because Bobby V, again, he was a huge hit. He had more number one hits in the 60s than the Stones did because of that early time period. He used to say that he would go to the Brill building and he would pull a song out of his mail slot on Monday and then record it on Friday, and they would release it or not. But he was there with the Everly Brothers and other cats at the time that was really controlled by the mafia, by the music mafia. You didn't write your own songs.
Right.
You did what we told you to do. We'll make you a pop star. You just play the game. And so that time period too, with all the pretty boy photographs and women, there was a lot of women that came out of that time period too, but they too, no one's going to let them write songs. It's a really interesting time period of the explosion of Elvis. And at a point in the late 50s, half the records in America were Elvis records. The printing presses just couldn't keep up. He just killed it. And a lot of guys came in. We got Chuck Berry, we got Little Richard, and we got a lot of these guys. And thank God Elvis looked backwards at his influences. And a lot of those guys were playing on black radio, African-American radio. And that's really what the British cats were studying. They loved Elvis.
They picked that
up.
And
they wanted to know where he got that shit.
Right.
And at that really is this, they were quietly studying our music. And really getting into that, they had their own pop stars, Petulia Clark and other people that were big stars, of course, at the same time period. But you read about Mick and Keith, and they were record collectors. Mm-hmm. This was like a sacred text to them. All the college kids in America were listening to folk music, Peter, Paul, and Mary, guys like that, and that really ignited a lot of things and launched Bob Dylan. But in England, it was the blues cats and what they played and what influenced them. And you look at the old photos of B.B. King playing a gold top and then the 335s and the 355 of Chuck Berry, and this study of American music that largely was ignored in the United States. It certainly wasn't top of the pops. It was down there number 40, number 50 in the Billboard charts. But that looking back at what those instruments they used by the late 60s became really important. And of course, if we were talking about the popularity of guitars in general, it's the Beatles that light up all the fireworks.
Right. People always, they talk about why is Fender and why Gibson. Now you have to think from 1951 to 1959, there was an embargo of American-made goods in England. So all these war children that grow up skiffle turned rockers, they're not using Gibsons, they're not using Les Paul, they're not using any of these. They dream about using those. They're using the cheap stuff that's made in Czechoslovakia, Germany, whatever they can get their hands on. Italy, yes.
Anything.
They bring all that.
Yeah.
There is no Stratocasters. There are no, in 1959, of course, Marvin brings in the Stratocaster, but that was a very hard to get. I always tell people the reason our Stratocaster is worth so much now is because when that one Olympic white Stratocaster was available in 1962 in Germany, George Harrison was 1 hour late picking it up to get there.
Right.
And the guy that was in Rory and the Hurricanes bought it. That was Ringo Starr's band. And because of that, Beatles did not use Stratocasters. The next guitar that George Harrison got was the Duo Jet. He saw that, and that broke his heart that he couldn't get the Stratocaster. Once he gets the Gretsch Duo Jet, that's it. He's set with Gretsch. He loves that Duo Jet. And the same thing with that 325 that John Lennon buys. That thing was sitting on the wall. Nobody really wanted it, that short scale thing. And he wanted a Rickenbacker. There it was. And that's here we start off 1964. Everybody in America wants Rickenbacker, Gretsch. They're not even making the Les Paul anymore. That the Stratocasters kind of like by 1967, they moved the code number on the Stratocaster neck from 2 to, 14 or 13 or something like that, because it's about to get phased out. And then, and so that's just the thing is that the Stratocaster is not selling. The Telecaster just kind of, the Telecaster cost about what a Mustang cost in 1965, and Jazz Masters and Jaguars are kind of where Fender is right now. Nobody really cares about that Telecaster anymore, except for the country western guys. And it's just amazing to me. The market looks like it does now. There's the same reason it really looked like it did in 1970 is because Les Pauls weren't that popular and Stratocasters weren't that popular in rock and roll.
I think as we get into the future of these talks like this, that all of that it starts getting into more the minutia that I think a lot of people are know. Jimmy Page plays a Les Paul, and that really did ignite it. Jimmy Page, we found Jimmy Page's lost guitar, that black Les Paul Custom. He couldn't get a guitar in England back then because of what you were talking about. They kept it under the counter. Mm-hmm. It was kind of illegal. They were dealing in that kind of thing if they could, and any of the bands wanted it. And people want what they can't have. Right. That's a big rule of anything. Yeah, that's the rule
British
of
invasion. They come to America and they go home with Fender amps, Les Pauls, and Stratocasters, Telecasters.
It's hard to imagine, though, as you're thinking of that, like you were saying previously, as all these bands everybody wanted guitars. There was still the fire burning from Elvis. The Beatles did it. The Stones did it. They were putting together bands. The Beatles and the Stones, there was blues students that really studied it. It was almost like a highbrow to be listening to lowbrow music and the tools that they use, but they couldn't get them. So they really did lust after that. And Jimmy Page in 1961 sees one, and he just has to have it. It was this like sacred thing to get this, and now here he is doing session works with Petula Clark, with James Bond, with all these early session guys. He was a cat, Jimmy Page, playing a black Les Paul Custom, and the reason he wanted it is because no one else had it. It's exclusivity. People want what they can't have, and there was something really exclusive. And when he bought that in 61, what I found interesting is always that the solid body guitar was only 10 years old, basically. It was still really new to people. It wasn't like now you go into any store, you always see a Les Paul. I think people just, are so used to seeing stuff. In 1950, Gibson made 5,000 instruments total a year. By 1965, they made 100,000 instruments. That is a boom.
Right. In
only 15 years.
Right.
It just goes kaboom.
Well, that's the same thing with Fender. You think of Fender moves from a 3-building factory in the late 50s, and then by 1961, they're in this huge complex.
Huge complex.
Yep. And then in 1965, they basically increased their production by 60%.
Yes.
And think about if you're a production guy, to imagine doing anything where you increase your production by 60%. And that's really why there's a cutoff. And we're almost to the end of this first episode here. But I just want to say, 1965, we're going to talk about this in later, why 1965 matters. But I guess the easiest way to say that the Beatles, now all of a sudden, quality is no longer important, but quantity is. How many guitars can we get out the door? And we'll let the dealers deal with the deficiencies and send them back. You know what I mean? There's no more QA on the line. Nobody's paying anybody extra to make sure there's quality, assurance everywhere. And that's kind of 1965. All of a sudden now, all the big hunters, all the Baldwins and the CBS, they're all hunting because this is the biggest thing they can think of. This is where you got to be. We got to be making guitars. And they're all over. In 1965, Fender sells. And then shortly after that, well, it's really McCarthy and Leo Fender are both gone from the scene in 1965, 66. Boom. They're no longer influencing anything. And it's all about money.
I think the boom really started to happen. It was no longer a joke. In 52, Gibson thought this was a passing fad. In some ways, they still thought about that just a few years later. By 1965, Fender had back orders on the Mustang, newly introduced in 64. They had 1 million units on back order.
Right.
So CBS inherits that, and they're like, well, then you guys just didn't expand fast enough, and they really did have to try to take advantage of it. CBS bought a lot of other companies, too. They bought Lyon & Healy a few years later, but they were buying organ companies. They were the broadcasting giants, and they wanted to expand and get into this rock and roll. And what you said before, too, Gibson had Ted McCarty was running Gibson and had really run that era, that golden era. Ted McCarty, in some ways, is almost as important as Leo Fender is in bringing things to market that mattered and coming up with clever ideas. The 335, the Flying V, the Explorer, how the Les Paul evolved. And like you said earlier, too, they brought Les Paul guitar, and he signed off on it.
Yeah.
He had the idea for the electric, the solid body. It was a functional idea, but he signed off on it. And once he left in 65, that era ended. We would turn the page here on this and look ahead to the next story, which would be about the growth era, but also Rickenbacker. Rickenbacker quit doing double bound. Martin opened up their factory in 64, so it's that same era for the new mega factory that Martin had. So even pre-65 Martins are a thing. They still use Brazilian rosewood for a few more years, but 65 industry-wide, even in manufacturing of farm tractors and automobiles, there is something about the pre-65 era that's kind of a golden era for materials, for craftsmanship, for working slowly on the line and not just rushing stuff through, and making stuff that mattered, that was durable, that was excellent. And tone woods, that's another thing. They became largely unavailable by the large.
And, I think the biggest thing, too, is that you get the machine winders come in 64, 65, too, the counters.
Yes.
And now there's no more scatter wound, no more hand wound, up to whoever. And then you get, then, of course, they start playing around with finishes and all this sort of thing. But we'll talk about that in detail. One thing, I think the most important thing when you talk about Leo Fender and Ted McCarty is that Leo Fender got everything right immediately.
Yeah.
Every time he changes something to improve it, the value of that item goes down. Whereas Ted McCarty, he didn't get it right to begin with, but every improvement he makes the value of that instrument go up for a collector, till we get to the fifth iteration of that Les Paul. And now, that it costs more in the house. And that's the same thing. So, anyway, so this is a good way to start. We'll definitely have to pick this up. One thing I didn't really ask you, Willie's guitar.
Yeah.
You've been in business since the 1980s, right? Late 1980s.
Yeah. So I worked at a store in Chicago that did a lot of repairs for cats, and so I met a lot of artists there in Chicago. I joined a band where they made you change your name, and that was kind of a tradition in Chicago to do a stage name. Mm-hmm. And I picked, or they picked for me, the name Willie Del Mar, and then I opened this place, moving here to raise two boys in the early mid-'80s, and then I opened Willie's Guitars shortly after that. So we've been doing it since '88, and it's...
Were you in St. Paul the whole time, or were you...
Yeah, I've always been in St. Paul. St. Paul's, it's like Dallas, Fort Worth. Fort Worth is kind of more old-fashioned. Same with St. Paul. St. Paul's kind of, they're similar sizes, but St. Paul's got a lighter vibe to it. And I always was in the center of town near the venues. We always served the pro community. That's my interest. You can buy a cheap guitar, not somewhere else, everywhere else. And so we really wanted to present used high quality stuff. That's what the musician is looking for. Something that's had a little soul rubbed into it, and something that's cool, that looks cool, something that's high quality, and resale value. Resale value is a big thing. I mean, especially after the last recession. That's our thing, and that's been that for 35 years.
Yeah, Willie's American Guitar is a very unique place. I am always looking at what you have and what you got. And you're the only person I ever sold a guitar to.
Oh, see, there you go. I'm proud of that, because you go through a lot of guitars.
Yeah, I do.
We've talked about a lot of stuff, and guitars. You've had a lot, of badass guitars, or still have, but that's kind of funny.
Yeah, and it's all because my wife has this new rule where one in, two out. But I can get away with only one.
Oh,
I can get away.
Yeah,
so
you're not alone there. Yeah. I hear that every day.
So I was actually good. I was actually obeyed her this time, and when I got that 63 ES 335 from you, I likewise I traded in a 63 Jazzmaster. So
Jazzmaster. Yeah, and that 335 isn't that a fantastic?
I love it. I don't know why I didn't have a 335 in my collection. I think I play that more than I play my Telecasters right now.
Yeah, it's
just it's like a tone monster.
It has that. I love necks from both 53 and 63, and for both things. And those are the necks for some reason. It has nothing to do with threes. I'm not a numerologist, and then the pickups on that particular guitar, that cat played polka with a thumb pick.
Yep.
That owned that guitar, and it has such a great clear upper mid range.
It does. I love them. The balance too. Very, very balanced.
Yeah.
But it's just funny. I left that, you sent me the new pick guard with it. I left the old pick guard on that's completely worn away because my fingers now, they rest right there. It's almost like, whoop.
Yeah. See, you've adapted. The guitar has forced you to adapt to it.
That's just how it is. It's going to stay on.
Yeah.
People may complain and say, what's the extra? They think it's a picture. They think it's a lighting issue. It's like, no, that thing is actually rubbed to the 3-ply.
Man, I got to tell you, that excites me. That excites me a great deal. I love it. Whether I'm selling to one of our local heroes or a national hero, I love it when they're like, oh my God, that is such a great guitar, and you get to go, I told you so. Yeah, great. Mm-hmm. It's such a fun hobby for that. They are beautiful sculpture. I have guys that don't really play, that just love them for sculpture and for investment purposes. But at the end of the day, this golden era,
they're not played.
They're just something.
Well, Nate, thank you so much. This is actually the great way to kick off this series. We're going to talk again and again.
Yeah.
I just wanted to start this the podcast series off. I'm always puzzled. 55 years, there's been a vintage guitar world, and it looks exactly the same as it did in 1970. It does right now. It's still Les Pauls, Stratocasters, Telecasters, and SGs to a minor degree, and 335s, And there's a reason why, and I think we kind of touched on that, why Gibson and Fender mattered so much and why they matter so much.
I agree, and that they really are the leaders. And didn't you tell me a statistic that Gibson and Fenders right now make up probably a third of the market?
No, half. Most of you guys know I'm the co-author of the Vintage Guitar Magazine Price Guide. I have to keep track of everything. I'm always on the websites. I'm always looking at everything. I keep track of everything that's for sale right now, and everything that's sold, I keep track of. And right now, more than half the available inventory for all used guitars are either Fender, well, mostly Gibson. 35% is Gibson, 19% is Fender, and Martin doesn't even come in until way down. Like, I think they're like 5% or whatever.
That's fascinating.
Guild is huge for some reason. Guild is big.
Guild's the sleeper.
Yeah.
They kind of are. Guys, as prices go up, they are looking at other things from our golden era we talked of earlier. But yeah. And then I have to say, too, Vintage Guitar Magazine has been there kind of this whole thing. And I've worked with Ward on a couple of stories, and they're just really focused. They've done some great stuff. And I've asked Ward, have you ever heard of A.R. Duchessoir, the guy that wrote the books, and he sent me, the story they did with him. You can reference all kinds of things through Vintage Guitar's website, through their archives.
I tell everybody, those archives are huge. If you're a subscriber, you got the number, you can get into that archive. And I use that.
And they've been there this whole time since there was a market that was surprising people of values. Those guys have come up. The old newsprint paper, and it's kind of fun to look at some of the old ones. But yeah, I sincerely, I just think Vintage Guitar Magazine it's important.
Right.
To our community.
And this podcast is sponsored by Vintage Guitar Magazine, and it's really just to educate the next generation, because our generation knows these things.
Amen.
But the next generation does not know these things. When you go to guitar shows now and you look around at the young guys, they're selling stuff, and you're like, well, that's wrong. But but this is what it is really to educate people about the vintage guitar, just about guitars.
Amen.
Fender and Gibson are a huge part of that. So, Nate, I can't thank you enough for giving me your time this morning. I know you're busy.
Yeah, let's play this game again, and you and I will talk anyway because we always geek out.
Yeah, we talk once a month at the least.
Yeah, right. So, let's we'll pick this up, and you call me anytime. And to everyone out there, have a good time. Willie's American Guitars. You always look on their website because every week you get something really cool. Really True. Cool comes in. The ad, there's always an ad too that says, this is what we got this. And you're like, whoa. Yeah. Yeah, baby. Yeah, well, all right, pal.
All right. Thank you again.
This up again.
All righty.
All right.
Talk to you later.
See you later. Bye.
Thank you for listening to Buy That Guitar, presented by Vintage Guitar Magazine. Please support Vintage Guitar and all they do for guitar players like you and me. Subscribe, like, share, comment on this podcast. We'd love to hear from you. Again, we'll thank Nate Westgor for coming in and doing the very first podcast with me. And I hope to see and hear from all you guys. Thank you. We'll talk to you again next week.
This episode of Vintage Guitar Magazine's Buy That Guitar podcast is brought to you by Willie's American Guitars. For 35 years, Willie's has been an international destination for vintage and quality used equipment. We are total nerds. We buy, sell, trade, do all levels of repairs, and just plain admire that American institution, the guitar. Willie's American Guitars in St. Paul. We love old guitars. Google us.